Well, China has a mammoth debt bubble, and its economy, could have a hard landing. A lot of Wall Street banks are putting, say, about a one-third probability on that. It's not just what the government owes, as is here, but there's a lot of corporate debt, and we've recently discovered a lot of it's denominated in dollars. And remember, corporate debt doesn't have access to that big tranche of reserves the Chinese government holds. Housing, generally speaking, housing has recovered on average to its pre-recession level. However, in some big cities, because of very cheap credit and the bank's penchant for lending to basically high-income folks and is skewing low-income and middle-income people these days, we've seen a lot of property values escalate to levels that may not be sustainable. We've seen a lot of rental housing thrown up that requires, rents of $5,000 to $10,000 a month beyond the numbers of people that can sustain that. With regard to student debt, $1.3 trillion. Most young people simply can't repay their debt. The Obama administration tried to minimize the problem with a study that said, well, the average debt is $34,000 per student. That may be, but a lot of that's legacy debt. People that have been out of school 10, 15 years, that never really borrowed a lot, never really earned a lot. A lot of your recent graduates are behind the eight ball and will be there for a long time. An awful lot of them are already in arrears. European banks, the European banks on the continent, not in Britain, have never really been fully recapitalized. The largest German bank, Deutsche Bank, has repeatedly gone to shareholders for additional capital. And European banking rules are written in a way very different than ours. The Federal Reserve can't bail them out. Think what you want of bailouts. The Federal Reserve used that opportunity to straighten out the banks. That's never happened in Europe. And I could see a German or Italian banking crisis quite easily. Now, all of these things, they're manageable if the U.S. economy is healthy and if the U.S. economy is growing. But at 2%, that's almost neutral here. I mean, 2% is rather weak. And that's been going on now for 7 years. Now, there's been a lot of hype. There's been a lot of expectation. The markets are up on the basis of, Trump getting something done. And we've seen with healthcare, there's no guarantee of him getting something done. A lot of your regulatory changes, all of your tax changes require legislation. And the Republicans, well, you've seen how they can squabble among themselves. That's the biggest threat.
Well, and that's what I want to talk a little bit more about. You mentioned political climate, specifically that political divide, not just the one between the left and the right, but even the divisions that we've been seeing now within the GOP itself. What impact does that play on our economy, and could that lead to a financial crisis?
Well, look at how much the market has been up. The equity markets have been up since, Donald Trump's election. But since the healthcare debacle, things have been waffly. I mean, they haven't sunk, but they've been waffly. Investors could easily become disappointed and skeptical about today's valuations. The market could take a dive, and that in turn could create an environment of pessimism that ripples through the economy. Already, consumers are not spending. The consumer sentiment indicators are great. If you ask consumers, how do you feel? They say, wonderful. Look at car sales. Look at retail sales generally. They're not happening. People are starting to get cautious. They're starting to get skeptical. It's not that the people that voted for Trump don't believe in Trump or don't believe in what he has to say and wants to do. But let's face it, the Freedom Caucus, if it doesn't get its way, doesn't get its way. And with that in mind, we have a situation where with narrow majorities in the House and Senate, the Democrats considering Trump basically illegitimate. We can disagree about it, but that's the way they behave. It's very, very hard to get anything done. Historically, Republican presidents have governed from the center. That's been part of the problem. That's why the Freedom Caucus is upset. But governing from the center requires them to make friends with some Democrats. Who on the Democratic side, other than Manchin and a few others, are willing to make friends with Donald Trump? Not many.
Yeah, you bring up some valid points, but you mentioned health care because they're still talking about tackling that. But you wrote in an op-ed for Tulsa World that Trump's saving grace may be immigration. Why is immigration reform something that could boost the economy?
Well, we're basically taking in a lot of people, about 1.5 million a year, which is about 1% of our labor force. Every year we add to the labor force by about 1% through immigration. And that's a good thing. or the equivalent number of people. Not all of them are workers. That's a good thing if they bring with them skills. Now, these aren't illegal immigrants. Illegal immigration has topped out. These are largely people who get in under the rules, but so many of them come through family reunification. You know, someone comes from Syria with an engineering degree, and then not only does he bring his wife and his children, or her husband and her children, they bring the mother, the grandmother, Uncle Fred, Cousin Sally. Huge numbers of people, one way or another, qualify. So that most of the folks that are coming in under legal quotas, and sometimes there aren't even quotas, it's unlimited, are basically folks that aren't coming in because they meet specific needs in the labor force. Many of them, frankly, are low-skilled. Half of the legal immigrant population is on some sort of public assistance, food stamps, subsidized school lunches, something of that nature. That's not a good, healthy immigrant policy. Now, in Canada and Australia, Canada, hey, the Liberals love Canada. The Democrats all really wish they were Canadians. They have the kind of policy I prescribe, and that is basically putting a heavy emphasis on filling needs in the labor force. And I'm not talking about H-1 visa abuses,
the H-2B
but really,
visa program,
getting serious about immigrants that we need.
Right, and it's interesting that you bring this up because they're talking about doing a crackdown on that program, the H-2B visa program. Final 30 seconds to you,
about
Peter.
That crackdown, by the way.
You justifiable, you were
skeptical.
saying?
Yeah, I know. No, when I look at what he's actually going to do, this sounds like one of Obama's sleight of hands. Like he says, well, I'm going to get tough with trade. I'm going to enforce the dumping laws. I'm very skeptical. I'm very skeptical that he's going to make a profound difference with the reforms that he has outlined. I think we're going to continue to see Americans training immigrants to take their jobs. That's a travesty.
I hope that's not the case, Peter. I hope it's not, but we'll have to have you back on to discuss this further.
This program.
Well,
he likes billionaires. The billionaires like this thing.